What I'm going to be doing is asking each one of you to put your hand up if you've got a question. And if you could start off by telling us your name and your question. And if it's for a particular panel member, then tell us. But we'll also have other panel members jump in as well where they think they've got something important to add. So who'd like to kick us off? It's always horrible going first. Yes, that would be fantastic. He's bringing you the microphone now. There you go.
Thank you very much. Charlotte Alexander from Carluke. Bearing in mind all the pressures, the economic pressures that would be on Scotland, independent Scotland, can we afford to maintain the NHS as it is and take it forward, just as Phillipa has explained?
Okay, great. Would you like to introduce yourself, Craig, and answer that question?
Yeah, as I said, Dr. Craig Gale. I'm not sure about experts, the right word, but I seem to be the one that tends to get the economy.
He's being modest.
Yes, Clydesdale. The starting point for Scotland is that our finances will be just as good as, if not slightly better than, the UK. Whatever we can afford now, we can afford in an independent Scotland. What we can then do is build on that. We can bring back manufacturing, we can bring back investment in Scotland, bring back high-paid, high-skilled jobs, which bring in more tax revenue, which allow us to better afford these and better expand these public services. So our starting line is that yes, we can afford it. The power of independence is we can do better.
Okay. Phillipa, would you like to introduce anything?
Having said I wouldn't add too much. One of the things that people forget is that we pay a share of all of the kind of civil service work that's done in the southeast of England. We obviously have civil service jobs up here, but some of the real premier jobs down in Whitehall and so on, the machinery of government is down in London and the southeast. And we pay our share of that, but those jobs are there. Now, if we're independent, we need that machinery, and we'll still have to pay just as much for the jobs that we here, which means that some of our young people will be able to find a high-quality job, and they will be paying their tax into the Scottish Exchequer. So in actual fact, simply bringing your civil service home means that you already expand jobs and tax taking.
Okay, that's good. Who would like to go next? Yes, in the stripy top. If you just want to wait for him to bring you the microphone. Yeah.
Siobhan Healy from Lanark. I was just interested in Phillipa, you were talking about the surveys that were done and the NHS in the UK came out quite well at the top. Was that per pound spent, money spent per head of the population? Because I'm aware from doing a course many years ago that at that time 6% of the GDP in the UK went towards the NHS, whereas in Germany and America it's 12% of their GDP. Yeah?
We still spend quite a small part of our GDP. We're at about 8.5–9%, whereas a lot of the others are much higher. We spend £2,008 a year, or we did between 2011 and 2013. America spends £5,017 a year, and yet 40% of their people have either no health care or minimal health care. And that's the problem. You waste so much money in bidding, in competition, in money going to shareholders, in huge expensive administrations for these kind of marketised systems. And it's estimated that the administration cost of them is about 30% of what the government puts in, whereas the kind of old-fashioned, if you like, what we have, is about 10%. So you've an awful lot of the money isn't going on healthcare.
Thank you very much.
Good. Next question. Don't be shy. Yes, so do the orange top.
Hi. Oh, it's a bit alarming. My name is, just had a break when I heard my voice. My name is Helena, I live in Lanark, and I'm actually already a yes voter, but I'm interested to hear what the panel's thoughts are about this. There's been a lot of kind of scare stories going around between scientists and researchers, suggesting that funding is going to be shut off because technically we're no longer part of the United Kingdom. What are your thoughts on this, and would it be safe for us to assume that potentially either private funding or something from the Scottish Government would be able to cover these research costs? Something like that?
Well, I have a quote from a professor in Glasgow University who pointed out, he's a yes voter, and pointed out that actually the MRC only provides 10 to 15% of their research money. They get research money through all different channels, including charities, including Scottish Government. And one of the things you have to remember is Scots are very generous when they donate to charities. So if a charity was not going to fund any research in Scotland at all, then obviously, and didn't go beyond the border, then they would also be losing our donations. So none of them want to do that. The reason we get a very high proportion of research is because Scottish universities are incredibly good at it. They don't get it out of charity, they win it. And the head of the MRC came out before he got nobbled right at the beginning of all this and said, oh yeah, of course we'll just do it the same way. You want research done in the best place. And then obviously a big kind of walking stick came on and dragged him off stage. I think that, you know, I don't think people in England and certainly in organisations are going to want to throw us into the wilderness or be enemies or anything else. They want their systems to work well. So again, this is a bit of a scare story. There is research that goes across Europe. There's research that goes between us and Southern Ireland. You know, the idea that suddenly all of that will stop. And there's a group called Academics for Yes, and as they point out, the universities actually earn far more money by attracting in international students than they earn in this 10 to 15% from the MRC. And because, obviously, of the change in immigration, they've actually lost a lot of these students. So they feel that the universities have lost more funding than what they would be getting. So I think, again, this is just kind of somewhere between a scare story and a threat.
My background's in physics, and I can echo a lot of the comments there from the medical field, where I feel about 70% of the funding came from private sources rather than state sources. And even there, the public money, again, it's very meritocratic. If Scotland gets more than its share, it's because Scotland's good at research. We earn it. There's also a big movement in the sciences for more international collaboration. In my own research, I benefited from work with the Pan-European Research Council Horizon 2020. And again, one of the outgoing heads of the UK Research Councils that I dealt with also said that the money doesn't go to universities based on location, it goes based on talent, on skill, on ability to return that investment.
There's the lady with the red jacket first.
Hi, I'm Marianne from Coatbridge. I am a yes voter, but I have been asked with a lot of friends and colleagues at work this question, and it's based on their wages. Each month they get their wage and there's 20% tax taken off and their national insurance. Is this going to change in any way with an independent Scotland? Will we see any difference in this? Is this going to remain the same? Is it going to go up? Do you have an answer to that?
That's a great question, definitely.
But we do know about money. This is turning into come on girlies. Come on girlies. You see, you let a man on the back.
As far as finances go, there is no requirement to put taxes up to fund Scotland's services. As I say, whatever we can afford now, we can afford on day one of independence. But tax is one of these policy things. Tax changes every year. I can't tell you what the tax rate will be 6 months after a no vote, never mind 6 years, or after a yes vote. This is the thing that governments do every year. One thing I can say is, in an independent Scotland, your vote counts 10 times as much as it will in the UK right now. So if you want tax policy to change, then you have 10 times the say to make that happen. Yes.
Sorry, one thing that you need to remember with tax is that the UK has the most complex and inefficient tax code probably in the world. They have 10,000 regulations, something like that, which means that it's an absolute boon to tax accountants and lawyers to find loopholes in. It's estimated that the Scottish Exchequer, by writing a tax code from the start, instead of one that has accreted barnacles over decades, would save 250 million a year simply in administration. Businesses would find it much cheaper to administer, and there wouldn't be so many corners to hide in, and therefore we would actually not lose so much money through tax avoidance and evasion. You know, there's a lot of talk about, oh, what we lose in benefits. If you saw the amount of money that is missed out every year from people not paying their tax, it just dwarfs everything else. So in actual fact, we would have the opportunity to develop a much more simple and effective tax system.
One of the things that Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling should be challenged on in relation to tax is that under their supposed stewardship, we had the most appalling levels of avoidance of tax, both among wealthy people, but also at the corporate tax level. I mean, I think it came as a surprise to all of us, even those of us, you know, who've had political interest, to realise how little many of these international companies were paying. That was under their stewardship, that they allowed this to happen. And we lost out on that, and it meant local indigenous businesses, they were having to pay up, but they were at this huge disadvantage in comparison to some of the international corporate businesses. But the main point I think you have to make in relation to anyone asking this is be very afraid about what's going to happen if you vote no. Because what we do know is going to happen is that the one thing they have all promised they will do, and some of this is already starting to happen, is to give Scotland more, I put in inverted commas, responsibility for its own funding, but give us only a very narrow tax base from which to raise that money. So what's going to happen is that, yes, they'll give Scotland a proportion of income tax, but you're going to find, what about all the other taxes? What about national insurance? What about VAT? What about excise duties? What about oil revenues? What about corporate taxation? In other words, we won't get our paws anywhere near these other taxes, and we'll be left with this very narrow tax base, and overall we will find the funding to Scotland will be cut. So that is the prospect with a no vote. A no vote is not the status quo. Scotland will get punished with a no vote.
Okay. And the gentleman there, yes.
I think with Craig. Yeah, my name's Alexander Carlu. If the pound is achieved as the currency, despite all the protestations, doesn't Westminster still dictate the interest rate? So will we not still be beholden? Will that fiscal element still be down south? And will that not impact on interest rates in Scotland?
Well, it won't affect the interest rates like mortgages, because they're very much based on the housing market of the location. Base level interest rate for government borrowing, yes, that might still be down in the UK, but that is a very, very blunt tool for economic control. It's about as blunt as it gets. In fact, you could duplicate a lot of the effect of that interest rate, like interest rate on your savings or your loans, just by creating a savings or a loan tax rebate, tax rebate. So the Scottish Government could step in and modulate the interest rate to a moderate degree. If it chose to do that, you could probably get more effect by setting up a national investment bank, and instead of borrowing money at that interest rate and feeding it through to the banks and letting the companies borrow them, you could get the government to directly invest in the economy.
So you have to counter that, basically.
You could. It's a very it's a very, very blunt tool, though. It's about the weakest tool there is. The other tools that come with independence, like tools over economic investment, over education, over health, over welfare, they're all much, much stronger, much more effective. And that's actually not my words. That is the words of the head of the Central Bank of New Zealand, John Brash, who gave a discussion in 2000 when New Zealand was discussing re-entering a currency union with Australia.
Right. You have to take measures to buffer it.
Not necessarily have to take measures, because our economy is still going to run along similar lines to the UK.
Yes.
So the differences aren't going to be hugely great anyway.
Right, okay, thank you.
I think some of the people make these claims, if there's a currency union, it will be the Westminster governments that are depending what you spend. Now, that is a different thing altogether from the question of monetary policy and interest rates. Yes, there have to be agreements on the level of deficit, but then you wouldn't want an irresponsible degree of deficit under any circumstances anyway. Most governments have some deficit expenditure, but you would want agreements on those levels. If you were entirely in charge, you would also apply that kind of discipline. But within that, we would be entirely free to decide how we spend that money. So the accusations, your autonomy would be severely limited, are not true in that respect.
I think also the term where they say, well, if you're in a monetary union, you're clearly not an independent country. I think you would find that France and Germany and others would take that pretty, insultingly to be told that they're not independent countries, even though they're in the euro.
That's actually a very good point. When Croatia declared independence in the mid-90s, the first thing it did was peg its currency to the Deutschmark. They are now pegged to the euro. Although they're not part of the European exchange rate mechanism, they can't be forced to join the euro at any time. But they actually want to join the euro, but they're told no, they don't qualify.
Isn't it true that when Great Britain was in the currency union with the United States of America, which I believe was between 1947 and 1971, we managed to have a national health service, a welfare state, and nationalise all of our industries, hardly American policies.
Completely correct. In fact, even one way, this was the Bretton Woods system that was set up. It was actually set up during the Second World War. People talk about, it could be really difficult, really fraught with angst trying to set up an international currency union. We've done it while we were fighting a war with countries that didn't even control their own country at that time. So it can be done. That currency arrangement ended in 1971, more or less because America wanted to pay for Vietnam. But we still kept, the UK pound was still pegged to the dollar, in the same way that Denmark pegs to the euro now, up until 1986 when Thatcher pegged us to the Deutschmark. That ended in 1992. We were still pegged to the gold standard until 2002 when Gordon Brown sold it all. So the UK has only had its own independent currency since 2002.
It's an interesting history.
Can I just say, the currency comes up over and over and over again. And if you picture an old-fashioned brass balance scales, on one side you've got oil and the NHS and tourism and free education and all the things that we hope to do with our independent Scotland, or hope to preserve with our independent Scotland. And literally, the only thing that is sitting on the other side that they've put all their energy in is a pound coin. And I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. We could decide that we're all going down to Whitford, and if you find a pebble with a white streak, we're going to call that money. It is just simply a method of doing things. I grew up in Ireland, and obviously Ireland kept a currency union for decades. They just, well, sorry, not a currency union, but just used the pound for decades. In Northern Ireland, lots of shops took both. They took pounds and punts, and when they were on their way to the euro, they took pounds and punts and euros. I mean, it just is a tool that you use. Since German unification, my husband's German, the East Germans had to move from the Ostmark to the Deutschmark, and a few years later they moved to the euro. And you don't see them complaining or wanting to go back. It is simply a method of doing business. And, you know, it's been made the entire reason why you would vote no is the pound, and it's such a hollow argument.
And I think the only people that really care about whether we keep the pound or we use something else are the stock markets, because they're the ones who actually gamble based on the value of the pound. So they've got long-term gambles, bets on about the pound. So I think for most of us, we just need to know what our pay slip's going to look like and how much money we've got and whether that's enough to pay our bills. And I know I won't really mind whether it's a currency union or pegged or whatever. Does that fit in with your thoughts and your pay slip? The gentleman with the beard here, and then the gentleman at the back. Yeah, against the wall first. Too many beards. I realised that when I said the gentleman with the beard. Half the room.
John Backhouse, English from Lanark. Yes, sir. I was going to ask, I was brought up in Kent, in a conservative part of the country, reading the Daily Mail and all the biases to get down there. And it's always seemed in the UK there's been this Tory-Labour swing from the left-wing ideologies trying to give justice to the poor and the disabled and everything, and spending too much money. And the Tories come back in and balance everything. Do you think under the new independence that there'll be an initial wobble to the left and a struggle for money and then a struggle to balance it again? Or am I just talking about this?
Well, at the moment, the government we currently have and the SNP are actually quite far to the left of our Labour Party. If you remember, Johan Lamont wanted to talk about the something for nothing culture and was setting up her commission to look at that, and free prescription should go, and we all can't afford that. So we actually already have a government that is considerably to the left. And they have lost 7% of the block grant since 2010 and are earmarked to go down to a 16% cut by 2017. And yet, John Swinney, bless him, actually seems to manage to make that go quite far. So I don't think that we're suddenly kind of just going to go, crazy and blow it all. But I think that they do see the chance to pump prime to get business going, to get manufacturing going. Because if people have work, then a lot of other things start to follow. Whereas what we're like a bit at the moment is a big version of the islands. Our young people hemorrhage away at nearly 40,000 a year. And it's kind of, last one out, turn off the lights. So I think they will invest, but I think we have free education, we have an NHS, and there are things that need to be done in it, but I don't think we're going to suddenly go crazy. I think they're quite proud of trying to be prudent.
SNP and Labour will carry on balancing the books.
I'm not sure how long we will have these parties, to be honest. I think by 2020 you're not going to recognise the ballot paper.
I think it's a mistake to assume that in terms of British governments, that right-wing governments resulted in reduced public spending, because during the Thatcher years, public expenditure was actually high. It's what you spend the money on. And she sadly spent an awful lot of Scotland's oil bonus on unemployment benefits. Very high levels of unemployment. That means declining tax revenues. It's a vicious spiral in many ways. So the outcome was not actually that you had particularly low public expenditure. It's what you spend it on. Similarly, if you look at the Labour governments, what they were spending money on, you had, between the Iraq War and the Afghan War, you probably had a good 40 billion on top of standard defence expenditure going into those two wars. So it's what people spend money on. And the key to all this is what has already been said, is doing what other countries, the more successful countries in Europe have done, and that is getting more, better paid, high-skilled jobs. And that was the colossal mistake that was made under Thatcher and continued basically under the Blairites. The assumption that what you do to get a successful economy is to have lots of retail, to have lots of service sector, banking and financial jobs, forget about manufacturing, the Chinese will do that. And as a result, we lost so many, 40% of Scotland's manufacturing industry was lost in about 6 years in the 80s. And it was an enormous mistake that the Germans didn't make. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to build up those small to medium-sized, high-skilled, high-investment, high-research industries so we get people better paid and they pay more tax. And you get into that benevolent, benign spiral.
Just to take another wee slant on your comment there about the UK sort of swinging between a Labour and Tory governments. The thing about Scotland now, presumably after Novo, is it's a fairly safe, by and large, a fairly safe Labour seat. Generally, Scotland, comes out a late majority Labour vote in a UK election. And that kind of sets up a slightly dangerous situation. The Tories and the Lib Dems, they can't win Scotland. They know it. They don't need to make policy. They don't need to care about Scotland. Labour can't lose Scotland. It doesn't need to care either. With independence, you'll get a Scottish government that has to care about Scotland.
Hi there. My name is Lanark Public Meeting from Glasgow. To be here tonight, strong yes voter. So that's not going to change, definitely not tonight anyway. You're probably going to get the easiest question off me, I probably know the answer as well, but it annoys me every single day. All I hear is, this is irrevocable, there's no going back, just fear again. There's some 141 countries have gained independence from Britain. Do you know how many have asked to come back?
Well, there's a wee expansion to this. The thing about it being irrevocable is, or no going back, it's actually just a factual inaccuracy. Scotland was an independent country for 900 years before it joined the Union. The Union's not been here since in perpetuity. If it became at some I'm not here to argue this, but if it came at some distant point in the future, beneficial to join a union, maybe a pan-Celtic union with Ireland, Wales and Cornwall, perhaps, I don't know. Well, we could have that discussion. Unions can form, unions break apart. There's nothing irrevocable about them. I'm not here to argue it, but it's just a factual inaccuracy from the No campaign.
Okay, and there's a lady with the pink scarf on, and then we'll come over to you. I'm Jean Barr from Carluke. I'd like to congratulate 3 speakers who were very inspirational. I don't wish to be insulting, but it is actually nice to see there is an age group, an age, a width of age to the 3 speakers. That's good. I was kind of hoping that with an independent Scotland, people in Scotland would be aspirational. It's something that depressed me when I was a teacher in a deprived area. It was poverty. There was just no inspiration in these children to do better than to play for Rangers. But my question is, if Scotland is such rubbish, why are they trying and working so hard to keep us? I'd like your opinion.
I think that is the key point. I think the comment about 10% of their economy disappearing, the oil disappearing, etc., is the simple fact that we have actually been bankrolling Westminster, and not for the 33 years. If you go to a Business for Scotland meeting, they'll show you the figures that Scotland has paid in more tax than the UK every year for 33 years. And in the 80s, it's almost double. It's about 60-70% more. And you think what was happening to us up here in the early 80s. But I got sent figures which was the first quarter of the 20th century, and Scotland used to pay in 4 times as much to Westminster, from 1900 to 21. And then again in the 50s, because they just stopped measuring it because it was so embarrassing, so they didn't publish the figure. But they looked at it in the 50s, and Scotland paid in twice what they got back. And we didn't have oil then. We had shipbuilding. Glasgow built a quarter of the world's ships. And we had engineering and manufacturing. And Glasgow was the engine room of the empire. And yet, how did people in Govan live who built the ships? Slum tenements, children with rickets, adults with TB, adults with asbestos. So, this has been literally going on for more than a century. That we send money down and it doesn't come back. And the only way to keep that was this relentless telling us that we are kept, that we're looked after, that we're protected, that we're useless. And there's a person I've been on a panel with a few times, Ash, who talks about poverty of spirit. That, it's not just being poor and not having chances. It's this, as you say, this lack of belief, lack of ambition. You think of, we would call it child abuse, if a father was always saying to his son, you're useless. And as a teacher, you would know that would never come to a good outcome. I know that there'll be challenges, but I actually believe if we vote yes and take control of our own futures, I think there'll be a renaissance. Having seen the energy I've seen and the ideas I've heard people talk about across Scotland on my journeys, I think there'll be an absolute renaissance.
And one of the problems was that so many of the aspirational Scots left Scotland. And the figures were really stunning. I can remember when I was teaching these, these kind of topics in the 80s. I thought it'd be interesting just for students if I taught up how many had left Scotland. What was the net loss in the course of the 20th century so far? And I thought, gosh, this has come to nearly 2 million. I thought, that can't be the case, and I did the sums again. But it was. Now, at the end of the 20th century, we began to get small net gains, and those have continued. But if you took just the 20th century, it was nearly a net loss of 2 million people over that period. And if you consider that this was largely younger people that we were losing, and the profile overall, although there were many semi-skilled and skilled manual workers going, but overall the profile was a more highly skilled profile. We lost most of our medical. One of the historical Aberdeen University studies, because they had very good records going back to the late 19th century, and they lost the majority of their medical graduates left Scotland, the majority of their engineering graduates left Scotland, the majority of their science graduates left Scotland. We kept our lawyers and we kept our ministers, so we had the theologians, but we lost so many of the engineers and the doctors and so on. And if you consider, for those who say, how are you going to sustain Scotland and keep the population levels up and so on in terms of age range, but if our population had only in terms of migration been in balance over the 20th century in the way that largely the English population for most of the 20th century was just in balance in terms of net migration gains and losses. Our population now would be over 8 million. Because at the earlier part of the century, birth rates were higher, so the accumulation could increase. It would be a very, very different Scotland. Some may say it would be worse. In terms of crowding, we wouldn't have as many open places, but we've got no shortage of land and space. We could do with more people, and we'll get more people.
After that talk about loss, isn't the energy in the Yes campaign just such an amazing thing? We have over 400 local Yes groups, from Yes Borders through Yes Clydesdale up to Yes Shetland. Check out their Facebook page, I've got a really cute cat. We've got non-local Yes campaign groups like Women for India, Radical Independence, the Commonweal Movement. Scotland is alive with aspiration right now. We are digging into what makes our country tick. We have never known Scotland better than we do now. I've watched two grown men in a pub have a stand-up argument over macroeconomic theory. This energy, if we get a yes vote, is not going away. We are not going back to the sofa after this. Another Scotland is possible, and we are going to build it.
Bring your mic down to the lady in the middle of the long sleeve.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm actually an undecided voter, and the panels have been very impressive this evening, and it does sound wonderful, but without putting a dampener on the whole evening, I am curious, when you talked earlier about our starting position per head of population would be exactly the same, we would be safe, we would be in that position as we are at the moment. On a very simplistic level, when we're bringing or creating our own government and our own policies, there is an enormous cost, surely, in doing so. So that has to be funded from somewhere. And I do wonder where that's going to come from. So that's the first point. And the second point is on a sort of just a query and an irritation, which is there has been much, and I don't vote Conservative, but there has been much bashing of politicians and how they deal with the taxation issues as far as Scotland's concerned, but it has been within Alex Salmond's power within the past few years to make differences there, and he has done things such as actively invite and pursue Amazon, for example, to come and base themselves in Scotland, and yet they don't pay income tax here. And that, for me, on a very simplistic level, is a bit of a puzzle, to be honest.
I'll answer a couple of points and then I'll pass on to the doctor at the end. When it comes to set-up costs, have you read Patrick Dunleavy's, the London School of Economics guy who wrote a report for Westminster? And even though it was spun for the media in various different forms, it's going to cost us billions to set up a new country, he went on Twitter, because I'm on his Twitter feed, to call out the Westminster government and tell them to stop lying and stop basically timesing his figures by 12. His report actually states that to set up all the departments that an independent Scotland would need, because we already have a lot of them, would cost 200 million. Now the way I put it to someone the other day was, you can either vote no and spend £1 billion a year on Trident and lose 4 billion off your Barnett formula, or you can vote yes and spend 200 million to set up your new country. So that's the way to look at it in that respect. And with that one-off 200 million, we've then got all powers to then generate even more income within independent Scotland, as Craig was saying, with our fiscal levers that we will have. I think that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, as Suzanne says, there will be costs, but you can't really think of them as a cost. You can think of them as an investment. You put this money down now and you get a cheaper to run, better government for the years to come. You bring back highly skilled civil servant jobs to Scotland. Those jobs pay taxes to Scotland, they contribute to the economy of Scotland. So everything ticks over on those high-paid jobs. And another thing the No campaign just really seemed to gloss over, government policy changes every year as it stands right now. Our share, Scotland's share of Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms costs around £60 million. So every time the government reshuffles a department or changes stuff around in London, we have to pay for that as well. So just because if we vote no, that doesn't mean the costs of changing how we run our government will disappear.
Isobel,
just comment on the second question. No, you want to start on the
Well, it was really only a simple example I wanted to give of how there are choices there. It won't necessarily be choices that you can change immediately, but if you plan for it, you can change. And if you look at how we used to spend money, if you go back 20, 30 years, public money that goes in housing, it was very substantially, I think the figure is around 80% went on house building, on building social housing, public housing, and about 20% went in terms of housing support for rents. Now the ratio is almost the opposite. In other words, it's not going on the house building, but it's going on subsidies to private landlords and, housing support. So if you're kind of looking at, this is what the Christie Commission that the Scottish Government set up was trying to say, that if you're really able to use all the different powers that you have, that any government has, and if you're prepared to plan ahead, you want to put your investment into preventative measures in health, you want to put your investment into building good public housing, instead of putting your money in to all the expenditure that results from failure. If it's failures in terms of education, failures because of poverty and the crime that comes from that. So there are important choices there that governments can make, but they do need the tools to do this.
Isobel, before you pass over, could I just ask you, the second half of the lady's comment was about Amazon and...
Yeah.
Well, just that, first of all, it's corporation tax, which the Scottish Government has no responsibility for. So what happens to Amazon and all the other companies is not the responsibility of the Scottish Government. What you could say was that the Amazon jobs, although there were quite a substantial number of them in Fife, isn't it? That the Amazon jobs are low paid. And you could say that what the Scottish Government, as I said before, should be aiming for is to get jobs that are the more skilled, high-paid jobs. But sometimes governments are presented with choices and do go for jobs, and make that kind of choice. But they're certainly not responsible for the avoidance of corporation tax.
One of the things that has come up out of a lot of the discussions is things like the living wage and the Common Weal, which is a think tank, the one with the motto "All of us first," is looking at things like that. I'm certainly not a fan of Amazon, and unfortunately didn't realise till I got a Kindle that you can only buy books from Amazon. If I'd known that, I would have bought something else. And one of the problems that gets me, and obviously gets you, is why am I paying their workers? Because that's what happens. They pay 0 hours contracts, minimum wage, or virtually below minimum wage, and therefore we, the taxpayer, pay that person through tax credits or housing benefit or whatever, so that they can live. And there's a lot of discussion about looking at things like the minimum wage. We hear about trickle-down economics from Boris Johnson, that we might get the jam off the toast. Whereas if you actually think about it completely the other way round, of trickle-up economics, if you pay people who are working a proper week's work a wage they can live on, then they have money to spend. And it goes from the shopper to the business, to the manufacturer, to another shopper, and it goes round and round and round the economy. And it does trickle up through the small and medium-sized enterprises that are Scottish, who stay here, who pay their tax here, who have their headquarters here. I'm totally not a fan of attracting in these multinationals who then don't pay their corporation tax and don't pay their wages. And I would like to see that we would look at things like the living wage. If you're a small company starting off, you could be getting support from government, either national insurance support or support to take on apprentices or to expand. But once you're a big company making a lot of money, you shouldn't need government support anymore. And they should be able to have that tailed off. They have to pay the living wage, and then the government can actually support another company to innovate and grow. And I think this kind of attracting in companies at all costs just to have jobs, even though these jobs actually can't be lived on, has been this kind of act of desperation, and it's all over the UK. And
that's not simply come from Westminster.
no, oh no, because obviously they are trying to get the companies in. It's often only once they're in. I mean, we didn't have Amazon. Obviously, they tried to attract them in, and they suck up to them. And then it's only once they're there that you realise that they're not paying their workers very well, and they don't pay their corporation tax. And obviously, those are things. What's discussed in the think tanks who are active within the SI is actually moving much more like Germany does, what they call the Mittelstand, which is encouraging homegrown companies who stay and invest and pay their taxes. And that's something that a lot of us would like to see. And the 3p Scottish tax thing, they kind of gave up the mechanics of that a long time ago. So in actual fact, until the Treasury brings in the Scotland Act, it can't actually be collected at the moment. So we couldn't actually have an extra tax in Scotland. But I think that's what we'll be faced with if we vote no and have our ability to put our taxes up by 15%. Then I think what we are going to be told is, you want a free NHS, you put your taxes up. And obviously if we have that we are paying 10% more in income tax than England is, that's not a healthy differential either.
It is still a puzzle. I agree with you, and I agree with the benefit of having a company like Amazon there, given the fact that there aren't that many jobs and they are being paid. So it's still just a puzzle as to why Alex Salmon pursued them as he did. Now I understand what you're saying going forward, how you'd like things to move, but that has been historic pattern, which is,
But that's been UK-wide. I mean, that's not just been a Scottish thing. They were all trying to chase after multinationals, thinking they would bring jobs in. And the issue of people not paying their tax and moving their money through offshore accounts and so on is something that, in actual fact, the international community have to get to grips with. But, I'm not a spokesperson for Alex Salmon or SNP or anything like that.
I feel he hasn't addressed it either, and hasn't dealt with it appropriately either.
I'm not a political party member at all, so I'm not going to speak for the SNP policy. But what I can say, if corporation tax or the way corporation tax is dealt is one of your priority issues, you've got two choices coming up. You can vote no, and then in 2015 you get one vote to vote for a party in Westminster who can deal with corporation tax, or you can vote yes, and in 2016 you get the power of 10 votes to influence corporation tax. If you don't like the SNP's policy, vote them out.
Craig, I think maybe the best one. Neil Harrison's sorry to bigger. One of the things that you would obviously save on in independence is not having to pay the House of Lords and members of Parliament down south. What would the savings be that to go towards the set-up cost of a new government? Or a new country, sorry?
Scotland's share of the costs for the House of Commons and the House of Lords, I think something in the region of £50 to £60 million a year. So, based on Professor Dunleavy's estimates, that's about a third of it every year.
But there would be a little bit of satisfaction. We should be allowed a little bit of revenge, no? And the idea, I mean, there are now, is it 800 people in the House of Lords, and they have legislative power, and we know that how it's used is just a form of bribery to get some politicians out of seats, and you say, you leave that seat because there's someone we would like to get in, we'll give you a seat in the House of Lords. In fact, I just saw an article, I think it was in the Herald today, or yesterday, saying, oh, there are some MPs who are interested in standing for the Scottish Parliament. It was Jim Murphy they had in mind. But they would have to get someone else out of the way to get him a seat. But there is someone that they have in mind who could be given a seat in the Lords and might be happy to get a bit of a push in that way, and a lifetime guarantee of £300 a day in attendance, and that would enable, Jim Murphy to get in. So it's used that way. It's used to bribe people who have, to encourage them to give donations, political donations to parties. It's used for all these ways, and we still have the hangover of the hereditary peers. It is a bloody disgrace, and it always annoys me so much that when some of these people, like Lord McConnell, pontificates, that nobody challenges him and says, but you have a vested interest, because you're presumably no longer going to be Lord McConnell if we get independence. And just another little reminder, the Dan Snow who organised that letter from 200 lobbies or others to Scotland happens to be the son-in-law of the Duke of Westminster. And the Duke of Westminster, the third richest man in the UK, and has the odd 100,000 acres in Scotland, and these are the people who are standing up there as if somehow or other they're above the fray and they're only wanting the best for Scotland and for the Union and all this kind of thing. They have major vested interests in what goes on in Scotland and in their property and other things there. Even the editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacres, now it's only 3,000 or 4,000 acres he's got up at Ullapool, but nevertheless he's got his little Scottish estate, and we're riddled with these people.
One of the things, just coming back to vested interest in the Lords, if you look at the people, you can get a printout of all the Lords, how they voted on the Health and Social Care Act that brought in the changes in NHS England. A significant chunk of them who had donated to political parties and then ended up in the House of Lords and actually either own or have massive shareholdings in private health companies, and therefore had a conflict of interest and yet were able to speak and vote on that. Now, if they were a town council, you have to leave the room and declare a conflict of interest. And yet that didn't happen in the House of Lords. And that was something I found shocking. And you can go into the internet and you can just print them out, what their speech was, how much they had donated, what their shares or what their connection is to private health. Because these are the people that are actually now making money from all these contracts from NHS England.
Am I right in saying that the House of Lords is the second largest governing body in the world after the Chinese Politburo, after the Chinese Central Committee? They weren't exactly voted in either.
I think there's also a point that goes back to the latest thing about Amazon and corporation tax. If you look, HMRC are the body that collect all of the taxes across the whole of the UK. And we hear an awful lot in the papers about benefit fraud and all these scroungers. And if you look, there are an awful lot of people that work for HMRC chasing down the scroungers. And you can find it on the internet quite easily. If you look at that, and you also look at how many people do they have chasing down all the corporations that are avoiding their tax, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. And yet, of course, the numbers involved, the corporation tax, is a much higher amount of money than what is supposed benefit fraud. And I think that, again, comes back to this point about, who's getting served well by our current system. And, people who are running multinational global businesses and making an awful lot of money and avoiding paying their taxes tend to be the ones with the best connections, either in the House of Lords or elsewhere. So it's certainly, have a little look on the internet about how HMRC divides up its staff and who it's actually going after.
I can give you the numbers on that one if you like. If you fixed all of the fraudulently claimed benefits in the UK, it would save you about £1.3 billion a year. But there's also about £1.6 billion a year not claimed by people who are due them. This is people who are owed these benefits but for some reason don't get them. If you fixed corporate tax evasion and tax avoidance, there would be no deficit. Simple.
What would be different about Scotland
as opposed to United Kingdom in making that better?
With a smaller state and a more cohesive entity, you can make a more unified tax system, a simpler tax system. Not to mention the fact that we're building a country from the ground up. It's a brilliant start just to throw away the rules and let's start again. Right? What do we want our tax system to look like?
The thing that would make the difference would be you. You are the people who would have a much more powerful political voice. And this is the point. We don't have the kind of tax system that we have. We don't have the levels of avoidance that we have by accident, because somebody's made a mistake. We have it as policy, as deliberate policy. Because the theory was, and Gordon Brown was one of the worst in terms, and Alistair Garrett, of going along with this, and that is, we make London the centre for the filthy rich. And we're back to trickle down. So we attract all these enormously rich people, and there are probably more wealthy Russians in London than there are in Moscow. So we've got these huge amounts of money coming into London. And that's one of the ways in which we will sustain the economy and so on. So it's been a deliberate policy. And that's what makes their idea that London's successful and the international capital, the home of some of the wealthiest people in the world. Now, I trust that most Scots don't want that kind of society. That most Scots want, it's not just what's the full range of incomes that are generated in a country, it's how they're distributed. And the more equally they're distributed, first of all, the more tax revenue you tend to get if they're distributed much more closely, but also a much better society that you have, a happier society than the kind that has been generated by the policies we've seen in past decades in the UK.
Just one quick point, which is kind of in the same vein as that, but I don't know whether anybody else from out with the area has noticed, but all of the no thanks BT posters that have gone out, every single one bar none that I've seen have been in rich landowners' fields around the area. And all the yes have been in regular people like you and me's houses and cars and what have you. Now, we're talking about Alex Salmond at the moment because he's obviously the leader of the Scottish Government. So as far as his remit goes, he's not done the right thing when it came to Amazon. I think what this campaign shows is that, like Isobel said, it's the people now that are doing the right thing. We're the ones who are saying, actually, no, that's not good enough, that's not right, you shouldn't have done that with Amazon. And at the same time, we have these rich landowners, which is a similar kind of idea that we are almost fighting against,
and trying to stop them doing Amazon all over again. We don't want these large corporations coming in. We don't want these rich landowners telling us that we can't do that, that you should do it their way. And it's stark across the country, the split between this rich mentality, the wealthy mentality, and the regular folk. It's so stark. The A9 is another example. In every single large estate field are the no thanks banners. So it's up to us, like Isobel said and Phillipa said, it's up to us to make that revolution happen.
And just, I don't mean that that's what you mean when you say about Alex Salmond, but obviously those of us who are campaigning, we do hear an awful lot of the time, that people don't like Alex Salmond, nothing to do with Amazon, but just that they don't like him. And I was trying to remember where I was in. I was in Dumfries on Tuesday night, and one of the chaps kind of comment from that, and I thought it was quite good, which is you're looking at a house and it's beautiful and it has a lovely garden and it's got 4 bedrooms and it's actually your price, you can afford it, but you hate the wallpaper in the lounge. That wouldn't stop you buying it. If you really don't like Alex Salmond, just change the wallpaper. Because for the first time, we will have not just the option to vote in who we want in 2016 based on whatever manifestos, and they will all have to come courting us. But in 2020, if they have not delivered for the very first time, we'll have the power to throw them out. We've never had the power to throw anybody out.
Excuse me, but could I just say that if it wasn't for Alex Salmond, we wouldn't be here tonight. But it's all very well to be critical of him, but at the same time, he's brought us to this point.
Absolutely. Well, I think that can I just say to some extent I agree with you there. And having known him since he was a 21-year-old, and been critical in certain things, but he's been a skilled politician. And one, still I think with some principles there. And the answer, I think, there's not been one person whom I have heard say, I don't like Alex Salmond. When I've said to them, do you like David Cameron? No. Do you like Ed Miliband? No. Do you like Joanne Lamont? Who's she? And it tends to be a bit of a rationalisation so that they don't have to explain why they don't want independence. It's easy to say, oh, I don't like Alex Salmond. But that really isn't the kind of core reason. And the media have gone very, very hard on this one issue, discredit the man, discredit the man, discredit the man. But in fact, statistically, it's a lot more popular than equivalent politicians. It's not entirely right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. That's all we've got time for this evening, but I hope that you've got some useful